The sun hung low over the prairie, casting long shadows across the weathered stone foundation where Margaret sat with her knees drawn close to her chest. She had been walking for what felt like hours after her old pickup truck finally gave out on the dusty road leading nowhere in particular. The engine had wheezed and coughed like an old man with too many winters behind him before falling silent for the last time. Now here she was sitting on what remained of someone's long-forgotten homestead, watching the amber light dance across endless grassland that stretched to meet the horizon. Margaret closed her eyes and felt the weight of 58 years pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy wool blanket. The diagnosis had come 3 months ago, delivered in the sterile white office of Dr. Harrison, who had known her family for decades. The words had fallen between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would never quite settle. Cancer, he had said in that gentle way doctors learn to soften hard truths. Advanced, he had added when she pressed for details, her hands gripping the arms of the vinyl chair until her knuckles went white. She had nodded and thanked him and walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, feeling as though she was moving through someone else's life. The treatments had been worse than the disease itself, leaving her weak and hollow with hair that came out in clumps and a face she no longer recognized in the mirror. After 4 rounds of chemotherapy that felt like trying to cure a garden by setting it on fire, she had made her decision. No more hospitals, no more needles, no more false hope wrapped in medical terminology. She wanted to find a place where she could make peace with what was coming. Somewhere quiet and clean where the sky went on forever and a person could remember who they used to be before life got so complicated. The sound of hooves on dry earth made her open her eyes. A man on horseback was approaching slowly, his silhouette dark against the golden light. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and moved with the easy rhythm of someone who had spent more years in the saddle than most people spend behind a desk. As he drew closer, she could see the lines around his eyes and the gray threading through his beard. He dismounted about 20 feet away and walked toward her with the measured pace of a man who understood that sudden movements could frighten wild things. "Evening, ma'am," he said, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of winter wheat. "I'm Thomas Webb and this here is my land, though I don't mind you resting a spell." His voice carried the warmth of someone who had learned that kindness costs nothing and pays dividends that compound over time. Margaret looked up at him and saw something in his weathered face that reminded her of her grandfather, who used to whittle animals from pieces of driftwood. "I'm Margaret," she said, and then, because something about his quiet presence made her feel safe, she added, "My truck died about 2 miles back." Thomas nodded, as though broken-down vehicles were as common as morning coffee in these parts. "Well, Margaret, the first expect we can figure something out about your truck, but right now it looks like you could use some supper and a place to rest." She shook her head, feeling the familiar stubbornness that had carried her through 5 decades of prairie winters and summer droughts. "I don't want to be a burden." The words came out more sharply than she intended, and she saw something flicker across his face. Not offense but recognition, as though he had heard those same words spoken by other lost souls who had wandered onto his land. "Ma'am, if I may say so, you look like someone who has been carrying a heavy load for quite some time." His voice was gentle as morning. "Rain on thirsty earth, and in my experience the heaviest burdens are the ones we try to carry alone." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. She had not cried since the diagnosis, but now tears came without warning or permission. Thomas stood quietly while she wept, not trying to fix her comfort, just bearing witness to her pain with the patience of a man who understood that some sorrows need space to breathe. When the tears finally slowed, he offered her his hand. "Come on up to the house," he said. "I've got beef stew on the stove and biscuits in the oven." The walk to his ranch house took them across a meadow where wildflowers still bloomed despite the late season. Thomas matched his pace to hers, never hurrying or showing impatience when she needed to stop and catch her breath. The house was built from local stone with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Wind chimes made from horseshoes hung from the eaves, creating a gentle music that spoke of lazy summer evenings and the kind of contentment that comes from knowing your place in the world. Inside, the kitchen was warm and filled with the scent of home cooking. The walls were covered with photographs of horses and landscapes and people with genuine smiles who looked like they belonged to this place. "Sit yourself down," Thomas said, pulling out a chair at a wooden table that bore the marks of countless meals shared with family and friends. Margaret lowered herself into the chair and felt some of the tension leave her body for the first time in months. Thomas served the stew in heavy ceramic bowls, and the biscuits were still warm from the oven. She had not eaten a real meal in weeks but found herself taking small careful bites as though her body was remembering how to accept nourishment. "This is your family's place," she said looking at the photographs. Thomas replied settling into the chair across from her. "Lost my wife Sarah to pneumonia about 8 years back." His voice carried the weight of old grief that had settled into something bearable but never forgotten. "We never had children, so now it's just me and the horses and whatever strays find their way here." Margaret set down her spoon and looked at him across the table. "I'm dying," she said, and the words came out clean and simple without the medical jargon or careful euphemisms. Thomas met her eyes without flinching. "I figured it was something like that," he said. "You've got that look people get when they're wrestling with something bigger than themselves." "The doctors wanted to keep fighting but I'm tired," Margaret continued. "I came out here to find a place to die with some dignity." She expected him to argue or offer false reassurances about modern medicine and miracle cures. Instead he nodded slowly as though her words made perfect sense. "Sarah felt the same way near the end," he said. "She wanted to go on her own terms in her own time." Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "You understand then?" "I understand that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is know when to stop fighting and start accepting." Thomas reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. His skin was weathered from years of working outdoors but his touch was gentle. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need." Over the following days Thomas showed her the rhythms of ranch life without asking anything in return. She would sit on the porch in the morning watching him tend to the horses. His movements were economical and practiced, the result of decades spent caring for animals who depended on him. In the afternoons she would walk slowly through the pastures, stopping to rest whenever the illness demanded it. Thomas never hovered or fussed. But she always knew he was keeping a watchful eye from a distance. The evenings were spent in comfortable conversation over simple meals. He told her stories about the land and the people who had worked it. She shared memories of her childhood on a farm not so different from this one. Neither of them spoke much about the future, but there was an understanding between them that needed no words. One evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Margaret felt a sharp pain knife through her abdomen. She doubled over gasping and Thomas was beside her in an instant. "Let me take you to the hospital," he said, but she shook her head. "No more hospitals," she whispered through gritted teeth. Thomas helped her inside to the guest room where she had been sleeping. The pain came in waves now, each one stronger than the last. "Let me die here," she said, gripping his hand. "Please don't let them take me away from this place." Thomas nodded and settled into the chair beside her bed. Through the long night he stayed with her, holding her hand and speaking softly about the horses and the land and the way morning light looked different in every season. When dawn finally came, Margaret's breathing had grown shallow but her eyes were clear. "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting me remember who I was before I got sick." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness shared is kindness multiplied." Margaret smiled, then a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. Outside the window the sun was rising over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind chimes on the porch making their gentle music. In the distance she could hear the horses moving through the pasture and the meadowlarks singing their morning songs. These were the sounds she wanted to carry with her wherever she was going. When Thomas felt her hand go slack in his, he sat quietly for a long moment. Then he walked outside to where the morning light was just touching the tops of the grass. The earth was still here, the sky still stretched to infinity. Life would go on with its mixture of sorrow and joy. But something had changed in those few weeks. Margaret had reminded him that every person who crosses our path carries their own invisible burden. And sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is simply to walk alongside them for whatever time remains. He buried her in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the pasture where she had liked to walk. The headstone was simple granite engraved with her name and the words, "She found peace here." That evening Thomas sat on the porch listening to the wind chimes. Tomorrow there would be chores to do and horses to tend. But tonight he would remember a brave woman who had taught him that dying with dignity was just another way of living with grace. The stars came out one by one, filling the vast prairie sky. In the distance a coyote called to its mate and was answered. Life and death and love and loss all woven together in the great pattern that connects every living thing. Thomas pulled his jacket closer against the evening chill and smiled. Margaret had been right about one thing. This was a good place to make peace with whatever comes next.